Mormonism, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Reformed Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Here's what I'm going to say as we begin. In my lifetime, this church has more than doubled. About 17 million people today. There's about 8 million people as I was running around with a few Mormon friends in my teenage years. And I'll never forget the camp that I was at, where I got into a discussion with a Mormon buddy that had come on a retreat, and we started talking about things. And as a sophomore or freshman, I think I was a freshman in high school, I'm debating Mormonism with a friend, but not really debating, just talking and communicating about what he had learned. Every day, high school students who are Mormon are at their Mormon seminary at 6 a.m. before they go to school. Mormonism teaches their children their faith. And therefore, they know their faith perhaps better than we know ours. The problem is what their faith is based upon. In any of our religions and the things that we've looked at, we always have to look at the founders of these religions. We always have to look at the character of those founders and what actually happens with them. So what I am going to share today is a lot about the founder and a lot about the story of Mormonism and what took place, and which brings us up to common day. There are people that you would know very well who are Mormon. Clearly one of our presidential candidates several years ago, Mitt Romney, very largely professing faithful Mormon. Stephen Covey, who wrote 5 Habits of Highly Effective People, is Mormon. Several organizations are Mormon, which gives it the billions and billions of dollars that it represents. Frito-Lay, Pepsi, Marriott, all of these are Mormon-owned institutions and led by key Mormon individuals. Not saying that you should not use those. Marriott properties are some of my favorite places to go and stay. But these are organizations that are representing this particular faith. But what you're seeing today is largely Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints seeking to be more and more mainstreamed. It's been very interesting in an organization that we support and work with, Community Link. We have our local LDS chapter is very, very faithful. I just heard today that another Mormon chapter bolstered, whether it was Tarrant Area Food Bank or in Dallas, 40,000 pounds of food. And so what we have to remember is, what's the motivation that's going in to all of these works that certainly benefit their community? The desire for our Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints folks is to bolster their community, to be good community members. And much of that is a learned behavior from some of the things that happened all the way back to their founder, Joseph Smith. And so we're going to talk about his life. We're going to talk about his death, 39 years of age. As Joseph Smith, when he dies, this is a portrayal of him. One of the few slides I have tonight, but here he is. But he was born. So if you're taking notes tonight, jump in here and I'll try to provide some of these notes for you. Joseph Smith was born December the 23rd in 1805. He was not 30, he was 39 years of age when he died in 1844. Died June 27th in 1844 in a jail where a mob came after him and his brother named Hiram and killed both of them in a shootout at the jail. They grabbed a weapon. They were able to injure several. Some accounts are that they killed some. It's been interesting, even as I've been refreshing my memory and reading these accounts. There are accounts that some died and accounts that some were just injured, but we'll get more into that story. But Joseph was born in Vermont, but his family quickly moved to Palmyra, New York. Palmyra is a significant place. Now, this is in the 1800s, so some things that are taking place in the 1800s. Well, not too long before the 1800s, this little skirmish occurred, and it was called the Revolutionary War. So this is the age and time in which Joseph Smith is born into. America is just a fledgling nation of only about 30 years of age when Joseph Smith is born. But in Palmyra, there were some significant things that were happening in Palmyra, and there were lots of treasure hunters. Blackbeard's treasure was thought to be in this general area, and there were people who would hunt for buried treasure. Joseph Smith's father was one of these individuals. And as he would hunt for buried treasure, he would use diviner's rods, where he would think that they would begin to lead him to buried treasure, but he would also use something called peepstones, where he would look through some type of gem, likely cut glass, and as he peered through it, he believed that he would see potential buried treasure locations. Now, this plays hugely into the issues and things that Joseph Smith, the things that actually happened with him. But Palmyra, New York, is also a significant place. There's a couple of handouts, guys, if you want to pick them up on your way in. But Palmyra is also a location where there was great religious fervor. The Azusa Street revivals were taking place. Keep in mind, the First Great Awakening is occurring. We'll learn more about that in our history course, which, by the way, Chris, don't fall out with this. We've delayed our history course. Instead of starting it in the spring, we're going to start it next fall. We're needing a little bit more time to put some of those things together. So just hold your jets. We're gonna run that next fall, and our intent is to do early church to Reformation in the fall, and then Reformation and beyond in the spring for that church history course. But one of the things we'll talk about in the church history course, especially in the second half, is the two great Reformations. So one of these Reformations is happening in this New York area, and it's the Azusa Street Revival. So it's a Pentecostal-based fervor that's taking place, and lots of churches are getting in uproars. They're seeing signs. There's all kinds of religious things that are happening in this place, and this is the environment in which Joseph Smith is growing up. His father is this treasure hunter, and in 1820, he's 15 years of age, and he has a vision that God the Father and God the Son appear to him while he's praying in the woods at 15 years of age. And they declare to him that all churches that his family is being sought by are in error, and that all creeds have been corrupted and are an abomination. And so that he will, at one point in time in his life, keep in mind he's 15 at this time, but he will begin a new movement, a proper church, a church that goes back to some of the original understandings of what the church actually should be. And in 1823, he has another vision. In this vision, the angel Moroni, Maroni, not macaroni, but Moroni. Moroni appears to him and tells him of some buried plates that exist from an ancient civilization, that they're buried in and near Palmyra, New York, and that he will one day make him aware of these plates. And certainly in 1820, purportedly in 1827, so that happens in 1823, Angel Moroni. By the way, the Angel Moroni talks about his father, whose name is Mormon. Okay? So, two angels, father angel, Mormon, son angel, Moroni. And Moroni is delivering this message to Joseph Smith. Now, I want to stop here and just remind you, what religions have we seen that have significant visions of new works and new religions that should be taking place? Muslim, okay? So Muhammad is one of those. One that we didn't study in Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism has a vision type experience like this. Sikhism, which we didn't study, but Sikhism also, with a man named Nanak, has a vision to say Islam is wrong, Hinduism is wrong, and there's going to be a new religion that blends both of those. So the point is that if Joseph Smith had any understanding of any of these religions, which it's very highly possible that he did, there seems to be a reenactment of some of these same stories. So Moroni delivers this message that at a certain time he will make known and available to Joseph Smith these ancient golden plates of an ancient Egyptian, Reformed Egyptian hieroglyphic language. Now, at times tonight, you're going to think I'm making this up, all right? I am not making this up. I try to be a good storyteller, and I don't think I could make this one up. So, Moroni appears again and shows him in 1827 where these plates are. And Joseph Smith uncovers this stone box that holds the ancient hieroglyphic Reformed Egyptian plates. Now, what year is this? 1827. There's a significant event that had been happening since then, or earlier. In 1798, this individual named Napoleon. Anybody ever heard of him? Napoleon uncovers the Great Pyramids in Egypt. And from 1798 until the time of Joseph Smith, what's taking place is this huge understanding and desire for knowledge about ancient Egypt. Has anybody ever heard, she's not in here right now, I don't know where she went, where Shauna is. She is my, does anybody know the story, the backstory of Downton Abbey? You guys know that story? Well, the actual house of Downton Abbey, the person who actually built the house was a major Egyptian archaeologist and was alive during this particular time. The original builder of the house that is Downton Abbey, or the house that they use for Downton Abbey, he was an Egyptian archaeologist. And there is incredible fervor going around about Egypt. And Joseph Smith later gets his hands on an actual papyrus from ancient Egypt, and he writes a book that he says is translated from that has now been proven that none of the things that were on that particular papyrus relate to anything that Joseph Smith wrote. But Joseph Smith felt, or somehow he had this understanding of this ancient hieroglyphic language. But he didn't really need that, because remember the peep stones that his father used? There are two stones that were on the breastplate. They actually weren't on the breastplate. There were 12 stones on the breastplate of the high priest, and there were 2 stones on the shoulders, the Urim and the Thummim. Okay, say that 14 times fast. Okay, Urim and Thummim. Shauna, I just made a Downton Abbey reference, and you weren't in here to hear it. You'll have to get it from your mom. All right, or I will tell it to you again afterwards. So here's what happens. Joseph Smith purportedly finds the plates, and he takes the plates. And Zach and I set up a demonstration for you, because it was just like this. Joseph Smith goes on one side, and he looks in a hat, so likely a top hat, and he places his face in the top hat. He places one of the golden plates in the bottom of the hat, which no one has seen. Only Joseph Smith can see the actual plates, because Moroni has told him only he can see them. He takes the hat, he takes the peep stone, the Urim and Thummim, and he peers into it inside the hat. And he tells the story over the blacked out sheet to his friend named Oliver Cowdery on this side. And Oliver Cowdery is writing down what Joseph Smith says. He then repeats back over the cloth what he wrote down, and Joseph Smith tells him whether it's accurate or not. Not too much unlike Christina Brown and I, as we wrote a script together today, going back and forth across that. Isn't that, so that's an illustration just for you, Christina, today. So, this is how the Book of Mormon was translated. No one else ever saw the golden plates except for Joseph Smith, except for two other people, which we'll talk about in just a second. So he tells this story, and Oliver Cowdery writes it down, and this is what becomes the Book of Mormon. And what is the Book of Mormon? The Book of Mormon is a story of two ancient Native American tribes. Everybody, are you on the edge of your seat? These two Native American tribes are known as the Nephites and the Lamanites. The Nephites are an evil tribe. They have settled in the southeast coast of South America. Now, in that area, we have the Aztecs, the Mayans, and so of Peru, but that's not even the area in which they are. But the Nephites are there. The Lamanites are actually an ancient Hebrew tribe that has made their way to North America via boat from Israel. I'm not making this up. All right? They represent the God-fearing tribe. And what occurs is the Nephites, the evil tribe, and the Lamanites have a war. And they eventually end up in Palmyra, New York area of North America. And the Nephites defeat and kill out all of the Lamanites. And only Mormon and Moroni are left. And they tell the story on these ancient plates and then bury them for Joseph Smith to later find. The story of the Book of Mormon and how Jesus Christ came to North America and visited these ancient tribes of Indians. So this is the story of the Book of Mormon, which in actuality quotes several chapters of Isaiah word for word from the King James Version. Now, when did these tribes supposedly come? Their story happens between 600 BC and 425 AD, a period of 1,000 years that these tribes are warring during this time. Jesus comes evidently sometime during his lifetime, and he comes to North America. How he gets here, I do not know that part of the story, but he comes to North America and witnesses to these tribes. Now, the interesting thing is, how did the King James Version get translated word for word into an ancient text that was written between 600 and 425 when the King James Version of Elizabethan English was translated in 1611? So all these things are things for you to think about in the understanding of this process. So this is the story that the Book of Mormon tells, is the story of these two ancient tribes, their war that takes place, and the desire for the good tribe, the Lamanites, to try to overtake the Nephites. So that's the story of the Book of Mormon. So these are some of the things that happened. Now, what are some things that were happening at the time? Well, there was an individual who was actually a clergyman. Now, at this time, clergymen were typically circuit riders. So by circuit riders, they would not just serve a particular church. They would travel among churches. And there was a clergyman named Solomon Spaulding. And is that Joseph Smith calling? Terry, is it? It's Moroni. All right. That's Moroni, okay? It sounds a little bit better than Moroni. I mean, come on. What? And it may be Moroni, but I'm going to say Moroni. It just sounds slightly more intelligent. I don't know. But Solomon Spaulding writes a book about two ancient Native American tribes. And he leaves it with a printer, and his manuscript is stolen right around the time when Joseph Smith was about 20 years of age. And he was often, so it's never seen again, but Spaulding is often telling stories of the Lamanites and Nephites, these two fictitious tribes that he has written a fictional novel about. So that's one of the stories refuting some of the things that takes place. there was a professor at the time named Charles Anthon of Columbia University, and Smith quotes Anthon that he says this about the translation, that the translation was correct, more so than any he had ever seen translated from ancient Egyptian before. However, that's quoted in one of the major books of Mormonism called The Pearl of Great Price. However, Dr. Anthon has been documented as vehemently denying any consultation with any actual plates and stating that the paper that he saw contained anything else but Egyptian hieroglyphics. So Dr. Anthon himself refutes what Joseph Smith says. But here's what happens. Joseph Smith marries, and his wife, Emma, and they, with a few folks who are following this newfound faith, it is started as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or actually the Church of Mormonism, and then it later changes its name. But with about 5 families, he leaves Palmyra, New York, because they're promoting polygamy as one of those things. It's believed that Joseph Smith had up to 55 wives, some more, some say more, some say less, but up to 55 wives, the youngest of whom was 14 years of age. And polygamy was frowned upon in that particular establishment, and he travels to Kirtland, Ohio. And in Ohio, they're also not well received. They travel onward to Missouri. And it's actually in Missouri that he says in Independence, Missouri, that there will be a temple that is built in Independence, Missouri, which never occurs because they get run out of Independence, Missouri, just over the line into Illinois, a place called Nauvoo, Illinois. And what happens on that June the 27th of 1844 is that a mob of 150 is reacting to the fact that Joseph and his brother Hiram have gone into Nauvoo and destroyed a print shop that was printing a publication stating all of the polygamy and other acts that were going on with this particular group of people. And they broke in and destroyed the first edition of that publication and the only edition of that publication. And by doing so, they were charged with treason, and they were put in jail, and a mob of 150 raids the jail and kills Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram. So he's 39 years of age when this takes place. He's already married 55 wives, and he's developed this following. And now what happens? He's no longer, the Book of Mormon has been published at this point, the Pearl of Great Price, and the third book that is significant within Mormonism is called the Doctrine and Covenants. The Doctrine and Covenants. So Book of Mormon, Pearl of Great Price, and Doctrine and Covenants. These are the 3 significant books of Mormonism. So he dies, and Brigham Young takes over the group, who had been one of the prophets along with Joseph Smith. Now, what begins to take place is anyone who becomes, later it's called the president of the Mormon Church, which, by the way, the latest president just passed away a couple months ago. It was I think it was just about a month ago. He was 105. He was a formerly world-renowned heart surgeon who had retired from being a surgeon to become the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that's a mouthful, by the way, and I'm going to say it. Can I just say LDS at that point? Okay. So he was the latest president. They've not, to my knowledge, have not named the newest one yet, but it's coming shortly. And I'll tell you the kind of the hierarchy of where it comes from and how you get to that particular point. But typically, these are always old men when they come to the presidency, and so sometimes their terms are long, and sometimes their terms are very short as a result of that. Brigham Young leads the LDS Church westward. Now, there's a significant issue that takes place because Emma believes that her son should lead the newfound formed church. Brigham Young has the more authority, and he takes the group and moves them westward. Emma and her family remain there in that general area, and they start a Reformed church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in that general area. And so you kind of have two groups forming. The larger group has gone with Brigham Young, and they go on a westward expansion. Now, again, this is when the whole westward movement is taking place, and there's lots of people moving west, and they settle in the Great Salt Lake in Utah, and they develop that. That has become a governmental area to which it is largely all controlled by the Mormon Church. And again, the assets of the Mormon Church are huge. And many things like, by the way, your family ancestry sites are likely have a connection to the Mormon Church. Why? Because they've been keeping credible records of all genealogies for a reason that we're going to talk about later, to inhabit the terrestrial and telestial kingdoms of Mormonism. Because every person who ever lives is going to be in one of the three levels of heaven of Mormonism. So there's three levels of heaven, and every person is going to be in one of those three. But Mormons are going to be in the highest level, what's called the celestial kingdom. Now, on your diagram, I'm going to come back to that, but you see those on the far right side. You see the celestial, the terrestrial, and the telestial kingdoms. Okay? Those are the three levels of heaven that all people will go to, but they go to hell first. So we're going to come back to that. It's going to be one of the last things that I actually talk about at the end of the evening tonight. So many contradictory issues are taking place during this time, but Brigham Young comes up with a major theory. Now, here's what you need to understand. The person who is the highest prophet in Mormonism, when they speak, it is considered equal to Scripture. The problem is they say a lot of things, and they say things that are really hard to back up. And later generations have to go back and try to figure out, what can we handle that this person said, and how documented was it, and how do we distance away? For instance, today, the LDS is strongly trying to step away from Joseph Smith's statements that there are no other churches that are valid, only the Church of Mormonism, only the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Why? Because they want to be a part of mainstream Christianity, and people don't receive you well if you say, you're wrong and I'm right. And matter of fact, you're corrupt and we're right. And so those messages have gone virtually non-existent in the Mormon Church today. Because why? They're trying to be mainstreamed into the rest, to see themselves just as a denominational development within Christianity. And we're going to look at their doctrines tonight, and you see from their story of the founder, they are not part of the mainstream understanding of any development of Christianity. They will have some of the, if you read just the tenets of Mormonism, they're going to sound a lot like a pretty standard statement of faith. But if you look closely into it, not even so much closely, if you just don't read, if you read more than the words and you read the actual phrases that are there, you'll quickly pick up this is not mainstream Christianity in any way, shape, or form. And so we're going to talk about that. But before we go into that, I've given you a pretty interesting story. Any questions about that story or thoughts about that, about these particular groups? Sam, you have no question about this? I can't imagine. Yes, Shauna. Yes, as interpreted by Mormonism. And it is the King James Version with a lot of things changed. So they use the 1611 King James Version, of which Joseph Smith, and by the way, it took him just a few weeks to get his authorized version, and it took many scholars about 7 years, 55 scholars, 7 years to actually translate the King James Version of the Bible. But it took Joseph Smith just a matter of weeks to do his, because he was taking it and adding some things to it throughout that process. Linda? Mm-hmm. That's part of the teaching, Terry. No, they didn't land in South America. They land. I don't think they're purported necessarily to land in South America. But go ahead. That's where the Nephites were, and the Nephites traveled up through Central America to North America. Yeah, that's right. No, no, no. The Lamanites. You're right. You're right. I'm just saying. I don't. I didn't say that they landed in South America. They may have, but I'm not 100% sure. So just being clear. Right. Mm-hmm. Correct. Well, it's actually interestingly enough, the Nephites were said to have been dark skinned. Now, what you need to understand is there was a lot of racism built into early Mormonism, which has also been written out. Um, Mormonism, um, people who were black skinned could never enter the celestial kingdom. They could only enter the terrestrial kingdom, which we'll get to in just a second. And also, it was highly touted that the Nephites were dark skinned. And so keep in mind that as Brigham Young is traipsing through to go westward, the fight against Indians was prevalent. So it was a very easy story to matriculate among the people of these two ancient warring tribes and the descendants who are fighting them, because they are now spiritual descendants of the Lamanites, and the people they're going up against, the Native American tribes, these are descendants of the Nephites. Yeah. So, nor any of the places listed in the Book of Mormon, there are no archaeological discoveries to verify any of those locations, of which the biblical archaeology do what? The plates have never been found. By the way, the story I told you I was going to say a little bit about, Cowdery and a man named Witt prayed to see the plates to try to verify Joseph Smith's story, and there are varying accounts as to whether they were actually able to see them. One of them say that, or said, that's the word I'm looking for. One of them said that he saw them spiritually, but not physically. Now, the other interesting thing is those two individuals left the Mormon church later, Cowdery and Witt, and neither one of them stay or remain in the Mormon church. But this westward expansion of Brigham Young is where the faith begins to grow. And then we're going to talk about why it grows as well. There were a couple other questions, some in the middle. Okay, Richard? Mm-hmm. Reorganized group, which is the remnants of Emma and her children. Mm-hmm. 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 that nobody else has, right? Well, now we actually question whether you actually graduated from high school, Richard. I think that's the moral of this story. No, I'm teasing. But but my point too is, again, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir is world renowned for its, beauty. The temple in Salt Lake, temple in Washington D.C. There are temples literally now built all over the world, and we're going to talk about some of their hierarchy in just a second. Yes, correct. Well, again, it needed to be something that a lot of people didn't necessarily know about, for one. Two, because it was very popularistic of that particular time period. That's where I said, Shauna, the owner, the first builder of the Downton Abbey actual castle was an Egyptologist and archaeologist during the time where Joseph Smith was developing this. So it's that kind of fervor that's going on with the idea of the pyramids and them being found, and so it's just a popularistic issue that's going on right then at that particular time. Well, so remember the piece of papyri that I said that he owned, that he called it the Book of Abraham, and he said it was actually Abraham wrote about it in the time in which he was in Egypt. And we document in the biblical text that Abraham does go to Egypt, but that Abraham wrote this story while he was in Egypt. And the Book of Abraham was actually one of the things that Joseph Smith did not complete, but it was completed after his death, that others began to work on that. And the only piece of that papyrus that we actually have is just a very small fragment. The original was purportedly sent to Chicago and was burned in the Great Chicago Fire. So we don't have that either. We do have a portion of it, the portion that remained. But again, it has been read, translated, and understood that this is where Joseph Smith sought to take this from, but there's nothing that relates it to any of the language, and certainly Abraham didn't write. All right? Well, let's talk about some of the doctrines. So, first of all, let's talk about the doctrine of the virgin birth. There is no such thing in Mormonism. They still say it's virgin, but let's talk about it. Let's see what this is. So, let me go back because it actually plays into this. Brigham Young, talking about Brigham Young began, as I talked about. See, sometimes I forget where I was going. I know that doesn't ever happen to you guys, but I was on the train earlier with prophets. Whatever they speak, it's considered scriptural. It's considered totally authoritative. Well, one of the big issues that Mormonism faced was what Brigham Young said. He developed what was called the Adam God theory. So I'm going to quote what Brigham Young said. When our father Adam came into the garden, now keep in mind he said father. That's going to be key. When our father Adam came into the Garden of Eden, he came into it with a celestial body. He was God-like. And he brought Eve, one of his wives, with him. He helped him to organize this world. He is Michael, the archangel, the Ancient of Days. Adam is actually Michael, the archangel, the Ancient of Days, about whom holy men have written and spoken. He is our Father and our God, and the only God with whom we have to do. So what Brigham Young brings into the equation is that Adam actually was a celestial God child that then grew and became man, and then eventually became God later. This is going to make much more sense when I get into these kingdoms, because right now it makes no sense, right? but it's called the Adam God theory. The idea is this: Adam is a spiritual father whom had a father, who also had a father. And each of these fathers are actually deities, which now makes Mormonism what? Polytheistic. Because there's every person who's ever existed has some connection to a spiritual deity. So I'm going to go ahead and get into the celestial kingdom because I feel like you're really lost at this point. Here's what happens. There is a pre-existence and the future, these three heavens. And what is happening within Mormonism is called eternal progression or eternal progressivism. It has nothing to do with the Progressive Party today. Nothing to do with that. But it's eternal progression. And here's how it works. Every person, this is pre-existence over here. In pre-existence, this is the left-hand portion of your diagram. We'll just talk about it now, and then we'll come into some of these other theories. What it says about it is there are intelligences. There's eternal matter that's happening. And spirit children are born into this arena. But they must become physically born because they must have gods and goddesses who are having a sexual relationship that they give birth from the spiritual children into the world that we exist in, this physical world as children. So every child that's ever born into this world has come from a spiritual relationship in a prior existent world. They become spirit children. Now, they become spirit children, they live their life. They live their life in a sense of this is where the works-based salvation is totally prevalent. It is what Mormonism is that you must continue to progress from a child. A child is kept safe to the age of 8. It is what Mormonism calls their age of accountability. They are kept safe, and at 8 years of age, they are baptized if they are Mormon. And once they are baptized, they are then begun to be educated. And when they get into high school, they go to this seminary at 6 a.m. in the morning, and they go through their 4 years of high school, public school, private school. It's interesting that I don't know of Mormon private schools, but they typically integrate into public schools, but they go to their seminary prior to their day. Every day, Monday through Friday, they go to seminary, and they're indoctrinated into these processes until they reach their senior year, and then the males are encouraged to go on a 2-year mission and then continue their college education. So you live your life, you do good works, you rake up all these good works, and the best thing you could do is be a part of the Mormon church, and most importantly, get married in the Mormon church. Because when you get married in the Mormon church, if Chris and Amy got married in the Mormon church, what they are destined is not to a marriage just here on earth, but here you go. You have a destiny of marriage eternally. And if you've been married in the Mormon church, you will eventually occupy a world at which the two of you forever will create new spirit children who come into existence. So it's like this cycle that's going on, and you're living through these spiritual children that are then born. So what are you when you get to that celestial kingdom? You are a God. And so Adam was a spirit who became human, and the fall wasn't really a fall. It was a choice within his humanity that was absolutely necessary for him to progress. So what does this get rid of in our theology? It gets rid of original sin. So they're not dealing with original sin. So what did Jesus come to atone? He didn't atone for our sin. He gave us the chance at resurrection. Jesus conquered death, according to Mormonism, and gives us an opportunity to be resurrected and to continue our eternal progression after this particular life. How many of you are really confused at this point? Okay, all right. Okay, so we're going to get back into Jesus, but I felt like I've mentioned the celestial kingdom a couple times, and we're going to come back to this and we'll finish kind of the mid portion of this diagram in just a second. But let me go through a couple of these doctrines really quickly. So the Adam God theory was significant, and Mormonism is distancing from Brigham Young's Adam God theory today as much as they possibly can. But it's virtually impossible to distance from because it's now so well known, and this is one of their prophets that they've elevated to this level. Okay, so that's what becomes. I want to go up, before I do that, I want to do one diagram. I want to do the diagram of the Mormon hierarchy, if we could. All right, so Jesus Christ leads the church through the prophet. Okay, this is the president. This is the one who has just died. Underneath the prophet is the president of the church, and there are two apostles underneath him, underneath that singular prophet. And likely one of those two apostles will come up to that level of the next prophet. Don't you know, that's an arm wrestling competition at that point. But they are the primary counselors to the prophet. But what the prophet says is what's scriptural, not necessarily what anybody else says. Everybody can read into it, but it's what the prophet says. Underneath those three at the top are the 12 apostles. These are quote unquote special witnesses. And then there is the council of the 70 who assist the apostles. This is a quorum that can have up to 70 members. In my understanding now, there are two of these. There are two groups of 70 now to add more into this. Underneath that is a stake president, and underneath that is a ward. A ward is a bishop who serves for 5 to 7 years, who leads a ward, and a ward has 200 to 400 members. All right? Every time you see an LDS church that pops up around you, they're going to be a part of the ward. So a number of these LDS churches will form a stake. And a stake is a group of churches or a group of LDSs together. And so that's how this thing happens. Now, I was on an airplane a couple of years ago, and I couldn't help but hear the two guys behind me talking. I mean, they were talking very loud. I was in a row by myself because it was a very late flight. I don't remember where I was going to or coming from, but and they're talking about their faith. So I was like, oh, that's cool. Well, the longer their discussion went, they used the term ward, and I went, okay, I'm cluing in. And then I really got interested in what they were saying after that. But so talk quietly when you're on an airplane. There's somebody weird like me who's listening to you. That's the key thing to understand. So the ward, the stakes, the 70, the 12 apostles, the prophets, so they have this hierarchy of the LDS church. Now, let's go now to, you can take that one off. But let's go to the virgin birth. So let's talk about Jesus. God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit are three different persons. Now you go, well, isn't that our theology? Three individual persons who make one Godhead. That's our theology. Mormon theology is they are three independent persons. Period. They're three different gods. Well, they have no problem with multiple gods because we're going to discover they have a plethora of deities, including, so how did Jesus come about? Jesus was a spiritual child who came into humanity and was birthed into humanity and eventually became God. Jesus had a spiritual brother. His name was Lucifer. Lucifer and Jesus were equals in the spirit world and came into existence. And then Lucifer became jealous of Jesus and started this process. Now, this division between the two. But if you'll notice back on your diagram, in the spirit world, the spiritual Lucifer has already been cast out of heaven. And yet he is the spiritual brother of Jesus at that particular point. He continues as spirit. Jesus takes on humanity, which is better than just staying a spirit. Why? Because it's this eternal progression. So he elevates further along the line than what Lucifer actually did. Jesus comes as a man. He goes through the crucifixion, but the key understanding is his resurrection is the powerful point within Mormonism. And why? Not because of a blood atonement of his sacrifice for our sin, because we don't have to deal with original sin. We just have to continually get better in this life. And how are you continually getting better? By doing a continuation of good things. on this earth. That's what everything is based upon, is how good you live this life. But what Jesus does do is gives us the opportunity to have a resurrected body. Now, while we're on that, let's go ahead and come back to the diagram. So let's get to, you see earth, you have then paradise. There are two places, paradise and spiritual prison, otherwise known as hell. So here's what happens. If you're Mormon, guess where you go? Paradise. But if you're not Mormon, guess where you go? But here's your opportunity. While in this temporary place, the Mormons continue to be missionaries into the spiritual prison. And some people will they will now have a second chance to become Mormon and elevate themselves into paradise. Okay? So that's the hope. Otherwise, they stay in the spiritual prison until the time of judgment, and after judgment, they're going to go to the celestial kingdom. But in between time, they have the millennium, but now you're in this in between till judgment, and after judgment, you have these three levels. The celestial kingdom. This is where godhood takes place, and you begin to spiritually populate your own planets. Ladies, eternally pregnant. Congratulations. What the what? All right. Second level, terrestrial kingdom. This is honorable people, moral people, but who never accepted Mormonism. So these are people who did not escape the spiritual prison, but at judgment, they were rendered to be moral people on this earth, and they get to go to the second level. And the third level is the celestial kingdom. These are the wicked of the world, but it's still a spiritual place. And then finally is the second death. This is actually where Satan and his followers would actually go. Now, what's the differentiation between Satan and his followers and the wicked of the world? Not 100%. Very unclear to me as to the difference between those two. But these are those levels of heaven. So Jesus was born by his father impregnating physically Mary. Not in a spiritual sense, as we believe, but in a physical sense, because he became man again for a time period in order to impregnate Mary so that they could have their physical child together, Jesus. Okay? So, there you go. No, he is not Joseph. Joseph basically plays the same part that the Gospels say that he plays, that he basically adopts Jesus and raises him because the spiritual father goes back to a spiritual being at that point. All right. So Jesus was a spiritual child, brother to Lucifer. Again, atonement carries that Jesus accomplished victory over sin, but it's really not victory over sin. It's victory over physical death through the resurrection, enabling the possibility of a physical resurrection and eventually a sense of paradise. Sam? In a sense, yes. That Adam, that the same spiritual being that was Adam, I believe, the same spiritual being that was Adam is the individual who impregnates Mary. Furthermore, at the wedding of Cana, Jesus takes on multiple wives at the wedding of Cana. Mary Magdalene being one of those, and another host of folks, potentially Mary and Martha as well, the brothers, the sisters of Lazarus. So, the point is, I'm not making this up, folks. And yet, underneath the surface, nobody knows this stuff. By the way, baptism is regeneration, so you must be baptized in order to be in the Mormon church. But not only that, the reason, coming back around, finishing the loop of what I said earlier, the reason genealogies are important is because they will baptize. You as a family member can be baptized for someone in your past that you want to get into heaven. because keep in mind, they're in this in-between place. And so one way to get out of the spiritual prison is to, someone who cares about you is baptized in your stead. And so literally, and I meant to have, and I may have her come next time and talk to us right before we, Jehovah's Witnesses won't take quite as long. And I'm going to talk about a little bit more about how to share our faith, because I'm not going to really take time to deal with that tonight. But Carrie Webster, who's on our staff, comes out of Mormonism, and she has a great testimony about her experiences. But there are people who in Salt Lake and at any one of these temples, people are being baptized around the clock. They'll take out these genealogies that we all read and are checking all these things out about us, and they're baptizing people for people in those genealogies over and over again. Sam, we'll come back to Lynn. No indication of that, but he has now, because he's inhabiting his own spiritual planet, and spirit children are being born to him. Because, and see how the Mormon theology has to work? He had to have physical wives here on this earth in order for him to possess a planet and have spiritual children later. So every deity that's in the celestial kingdom has had to at some point come through the earth. If you don't come through the earth, you're destined for this second death. And that's the reason it's eternal progression. That's the reason that Adam's choice was not Adam's sin, but it was a point at which Adam had to make this choice in order to then live a life of good, so that he could overcome all of the other things in his life and be born into this spiritual kingdom and continue this progression. He has to go from spiritual to physical and back to spiritual again. That's what has to happen in this process. Well, there is an element of that seemingly in this, that it is, but the only difference would be, it's not so much backwards, it's that you are creating new life. You're not living a life over and over again. So in that case, it's not reincarnation, because reincarnation simply means to reincarnate, to put flesh on again. So if this were the same person going around, that would be the case. But it's not the same person. It is a person, a spiritual being becoming physical, then being spiritual and giving birth to new physical, or new spiritual who become physical and go in that. So what you have is a universe full of planets that are being inhabited by more spiritual children. In other words, this idea that it's not just this earth, but it could be many other planets are being inhabited as well. So ET has no problem within Mormonism. It's not a problem. It's just another spiritual child that could have come here. No big deal. John? Yeah, but they're not going to depict some of the things I've just talked about. Because again, everything they're trying to do now is to become more mainstream. So the picture and image of Jesus is the picture and image of our Jesus. But what they aren't telling us is, how did he come to exist? And who is he and what's he doing now? So that's where this difference, the image of who Jesus is and how he lived his life is essentially the same, except for that he took on wives. He still lived a good life. Why? He lived the ultimate good life to show us how to live our life. Why? Because he was ultimately doing all of this eternal progression and showing us how to do it. Mm-hmm. In one singular deity? Mm-mm. Not in that sense. Not in that. I wouldn't say in that sense that they would hold that. Again, Adam was just one God of many that inhabited this earth. Yeah, I forgot to One of my favorite quotes was from a particular prophet. There it is. Do what now? I wouldn't make fun of them, but yeah, but the real atheists, well, they wouldn't be the real atheists because they believe in so many gods, it's unbelievable. Here's what Lorenzo Snow, one of the prophets, shortly after Smith, this is one of the most famous quotes of Mormonism. As man is, God once was. As God is, man may become. May become. Let me say it one more time. As man is, God once was. So God once was man and then became the God he is. And as God is, man may become. And why the may? Because it's all dependent upon works. And that's the key understanding of Mormonism. I mean, a few weeks ago, I did a message on Christ plus anything. Well, Mormonism is Christ plus everything. Literally. It's almost Christ plus anything and everything. Because the good works that a person must do, why does a person go on mission? By the way, there's about 76,000 missionaries now. Yeah, there's a lot in this area. And any populated area, that's where they're going to go first. You're going to get a few missionaries that go to rural Kansas, but the majority of missionaries are going to come to very highly populated areas. So the former president of Brigham Young University said by 2025 there would be 200,000 Mormon missionaries, and there's only like 70,000 now. So it hasn't grown to that extent, but it continues to grow. But why do you go on Mormon mission? Because it's part of your progression. Why do you do good things? It's part of your progression. Why do you be kind to your neighbor? It's progression. But here's what I'm going to tell you. Mormons are typically great families because it's part of their eternal progression. Again, this is where it becomes really important to our motivation for why we do what we do. Mormonism is the eternal understanding of doing the dance to get the hug. Christianity is we've been given redemption. Our sin has been covered. We do what we do because we have been loved and cared and redeemed. We do what we do out of appreciation and thankfulness and, what's our word for the month? Gratitude of what Christ has done. Not in order to do, but here is the caution. The cautionary tale is many of our churches are living life saying that you have to do this in order to be a good Christian. And it's a slippery slope. And in the 1820s, it slipped to the slippeриest of slopes to create something like Mormonism. Lynn, you had a question on it. Okay, that's a very difficult question. They can't denounce polygamy. In 55 wives, and so did Brigham Young, and so did so many others. What they denounce is that polygamy is legal in this country. But if you follow this out, you begin to understand. We would look at Mormonism and say it's just a bunch of dirty old white men, okay, as in this understanding. But if their fundamental belief is that you're going to populate other worlds, you want to have as many opportunities to have spiritual children as possible. Now, I'm not justifying it by any stretch of the imagination. What I'm just saying is you can get to logically why they do what they do if their belief truly is this. What I would love to be is a fly. Oh, if we went back to the hierarchy, and you don't need to, but if I'd like to be a fly on the wall of some of those meetings as to, is this really a feeling, a sense that you're duping everybody and you're getting away with it? Or are they truly spiritual discussions on how to deal with with the issues of the world or what's going on. And I find it hard to contemplate that. You have a second question? Oh, so I guess so when the Supreme Court denounced and said polygamy cannot happen in this nation, they put a stop to it except where it's practiced quietly or in seclusion. And again, we've all had within the last few years pockets of where we saw it happen. So, okay, sorry, I wanted to. No, it's not a specific set amount of time, and specifically in the spirit prison, you can rotate in that for a long, long time. Now, keep in mind what it's talking about as it's placed here. It's still going on right now. That there won't be any new. This is where it doesn't make sense. How did Jesus, get to this point of the celestial kingdom without going through judgment, which is kind of where they say it has to go? It has to go through this judgment process, which is also inclusive of the millennium. But how are spiritual children, how are they already there? And I don't know any good answer to that. Yeah, that would be so I think they're still going to make it that is one of the roles of Jesus. That Jesus and Adam, the father who was Adam, who was kind of the creator father, are somehow over that judgment. In eternal judgment too. So have you looked at any further than this, Terry, with this of how do they get to those beings being in the celestial kingdom now when this judgment hasn't happened yet? No. See, I'm fuzzy there. All right. Any other questions? Yes, Richard? Mm-hmm. 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 Well, so I would say they weren't the first missionaries there. They were early and they were very successful missionaries there, because there were earlier Christian missionaries in Hawaii, but they screwed up royally too. I mean, they took advantage. It's just look at the Dole plantation and follow the Christian history of the Dole plantation, and it's horrific. What some Christians took advantage of the Hawaiians at that particular point. But you are right. But it is heavily Mormon today, as well as Tonga. So Tongans are heavily Mormon as well. But you are exactly right. And so what's the similarities between Islam and Mormonism? Well, certainly the vision stories are hugely similar, which who would borrow from whom? Joseph Smith would have to be borrowing from Muhammad's story, if that's. But the other thing that's significant is the 5 pillars in all of these good work. They're both works-based theology. When you come to it, virtually all world religions, other than Christianity, are works-based theologies.